Just like we do today, people in the Middle Ages had to live with all kinds of diseases spreading through their towns and villages. It makes you wonder what kinds of illnesses they had to deal with back then. The surprising part is that many of those diseases are the very same ones we still face today. The real difference wasn't the illnesses themselves. It was the lack of medical knowledge and treatment. Back then, there were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and none of the modern medicine we rely on today. If someone got sick, their chances of getting better usually came down to getting enough rest, how strong their body was, and, more often than not, a healthy dose of good luck. So, let's step back into the Middle Ages and explore the diseases that shaped everyday life. Look at the remedies people believed would heal them, even though most didn't, and answer one important question. If you became sick during the Middle Ages, was it almost certain that you were going to die? Let's start with something familiar. Most of us have caught the flu at least once in our lives, and while it's usually miserable, it isn't often life-threatening. Even today, there's no magic cure for it. The best advice is still to get plenty of rest, drink lots of fluids, and wait for your body to fight it off. Of course, for people who are especially vulnerable, like the elderly, young children, or anyone with a weakened immune system, the flu can become much more dangerous. Back in the Middle Ages, influenza was just as unpleasant as it is now, but it was far more frightening because people had almost no way to treat it. There were no vaccines to help prevent it, no antiviral medications, and no pharmacy where you could pick up medicine to ease the symptoms. If you became sick, all you could really do was endure the illness and hope your body was strong enough to survive. Life during the medieval period was already filled with hardships, so dealing with high fevers, constant chills, and a runny nose only made things even worse. Then, during the late Middle Ages, another disease appeared that made ordinary influenza seem almost harmless by comparison. People called it the sweating sickness. The first major outbreak happened in 1485 during the reign of King Henry VII, the father of the much better-known Henry VIII. This terrifying illness didn't arrive slowly or give people any warning. It struck without mercy, often waking its victims in the middle of the night or attacking them early in the morning before they had any chance to prepare. One of the earliest descriptions came from the physician Thomas Forestier in 1490. He wrote, "Sudden great sweating and sickness with redness of the face and of all the body." Later, another London physician named John Caius witnessed the final epidemic and described it as a fearful time of the sweat. The disease spread easily from person to person and usually began with an overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. Soon after came a high fever, violent shivering, pounding headaches, dizziness, crushing exhaustion, and intense pain in the neck, shoulders, and limbs. After anywhere from about 30 minutes to 3 hours, the heavy sweating would begin. Victims also experienced an unbearable thirst, severe headaches, heart palpitations, chest pain, and even episodes of delirium. By the final stage, the body was completely drained of strength. Many people collapsed from exhaustion, and death often followed within just 8 to 10 hours after the first symptoms appeared. Even surviving the illness didn't guarantee safety. Some unfortunate people caught the sweating sickness more than once, suffering repeated attacks before it finally claimed their lives. What actually caused the sweating sickness remains a mystery. Was it filthy living conditions, contaminated water, or something else entirely? No one knows for certain. After sweeping through parts of Europe and terrifying thousands of people, the disease vanished almost as suddenly as it had appeared. Following its last major outbreak in 1551, the sweating sickness simply disappeared from history. Now, let's talk about one of the deadliest diseases in human history, smallpox. Historians believe the first major smallpox epidemic, caused by the variola virus, took place during the late 1st century and early 2nd century AD. That outbreak is known as the Antonine Plague, and it spread throughout the Roman Empire, leaving devastation wherever it reached. During the Middle Ages, wave after wave of smallpox swept across Europe and Asia, wiping out entire rural communities and leaving countless people dead. One of the people who witnessed the disease firsthand was Bishop Gregory of Tours. He described an outbreak that spread across northern Italy and southern France during the late 6th century. In his writings he said, Tours was desolated by the severe pestilential sickness. The violent fever covered all over with vesicles and small pustules. The vesicles were white, hard, unyielding, and very painful. When they broke and began to discharge, the pain was greatly increased. Gregory also wrote about the wife of Count Eberin, who became infected during the epidemic. According to his account, painful sores covered her hands, feet, and even her eyes. Although Lady Eberin managed to survive the illness, her husband was not as fortunate. Gregory described his body after death by saying it appeared black and burnt as if it had been laid upon a coal fire. Modern historians believe Lord Eberin may have suffered from the rare and especially deadly hemorrhagic form of smallpox. It usually began like ordinary smallpox with a high fever and an intense headache, but it rapidly became much more severe. Bleeding developed beneath the skin, causing it to separate as fluid collected underneath. Blood vessels throughout the body could rupture, affecting major organs and, in men, even the testicles. Very few people survived this form of the disease. Those who did recover from smallpox often carried permanent reminders of what they had endured. Deep scars covered much of their skin, and many survivors were left permanently blind because the infection damaged their eyes. In England, smallpox became known as the Red Plague, or, more simply, the pox. The disease returned again during the Crusades, bringing yet another wave of suffering to medieval Europe. Fortunately, smallpox has a very different ending than most diseases in history. Thanks to a worldwide vaccination campaign, it became one of only 2 diseases that the World Health Organization has officially declared completely eradicated. The other is rinderpest, a deadly disease that once affected cattle. But while some medieval illnesses spread through coughs, fevers, and infected wounds, the next disease earned its reputation in a very different way. People eventually came to know it as the love bug. Now, let's move on to diseases that spread through sexual contact. During the Middle Ages, infections like syphilis and gonorrhea were far more common than many people realize. Despite the popular belief that medieval society was completely sexually repressed, that simply wasn't the case. These diseases were well known, and doctors of the time came up with all kinds of treatments, most of them unpleasant, and some downright horrifying. When men developed swelling or painful sores on the penis, a 12th century medical collection known as the Trocula offered a remedy. It advised reducing the swelling by applying a poultice, carefully washing the ulcer or wounded neck of the penis with warm water, and then sprinkling the area with Greek pitch along with the dry rod of wood or even powdered worms. It sounds revolting today, but at the time people believed these ingredients could help the wound heal. As disturbing as that treatment was, it still wasn't the most extreme remedy medieval medicine had to offer. In the 14th century, the English surgeon John of Ardern described an even harsher procedure. If a man's penis became severely swollen after intercourse and was accompanied by intense burning and aching pain, he recommended cutting away the damaged tissue with a knife. After that, the wound was treated with quicklime, a highly caustic substance that would have caused excruciating pain when applied to raw flesh. It's hard to imagine anyone willingly going through such an ordeal, but according to John of Ardern, the treatment was successful, and the patient eventually recovered. No discussion about medieval diseases would be complete without talking about the most infamous one of them all, the Great Plague, better known as the Black Death. At its deadliest, between 1348 and 1350, this devastating pandemic swept across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and historians estimate that it wiped out nearly half the population of those regions. The disease spread in more than one way. Fleas living on rodents, especially rats, carried the infection from place to place, but in some cases it could also spread through the air from one infected person to another. The plague appeared in two major forms, bubonic plague and pneumonic plague, and each one attacked the body differently. If someone caught bubonic plague from the bite of an infected flea, the disease usually took between 2 and 7 days before symptoms appeared. At first, everything might seem normal, but then the illness would strike with incredible force. Pneumonic plague moved even faster, often showing symptoms within just 2 or 3 days. Bubonic plague targeted the lymph nodes, causing them to swell into large, painful lumps known as buboes. These swollen glands became hot, extremely tender, and when they burst open, they released blood and pus. Buboes could develop anywhere the body had lymph nodes, but they were most commonly found in the neck, under the arms, and in the groin. Pneumonic plague was even more terrifying. Instead of attacking the lymph nodes, it went straight to the lungs, making it much easier to spread from person to person through coughing and close contact. That also made it far more contagious and far deadlier than the bubonic form. As if that weren't horrifying enough, victims often suffered from high fevers, intense headaches, aching joints, nausea, and repeated vomiting. Those infected with pneumonic plague also developed a severe lung infection that caused them to cough up blood. With a mortality rate estimated between 90 and 95% if left untreated, surviving this form of the plague was incredibly rare. Even though the Black Death is usually associated with the Middle Ages, the disease hasn't completely disappeared. Modern outbreaks are uncommon, but they still happen from time to time, including a handful of reported cases in the United States each year. In a strange way, it's almost as if the Black Death never realized the Middle Ages were over and has quietly continued to exist in the background ever since. Now let's look at another disease that terrified people during the Middle Ages. Leprosy. This illness attacked both the nervous system and the upper respiratory tract, and before the Black Death swept across Europe, it was probably the disease people feared the most. Leprosy usually developed very slowly, so its victims often didn't realize how serious it would become. One of the earliest warning signs was a gradual loss of feeling in the hands and feet. As the nerves continued to deteriorate, people could no longer sense cuts, burns, or other injuries. Because those wounds often went unnoticed, they became infected and turned into chronic ulcers that refused to heal. As the disease progressed, the damage to the nerves became even more severe. Fingers and toes weakened, shrank over time, and could eventually be lost altogether. The list of symptoms was horrifying. People could suffer from bleeding palms, the loss of body hair and eyelashes, and even the decay of the penis. On top of that came the collapse of the nose due to damaged cartilage, painful ulcers in the throat, teeth falling out, and severe infections that could leave the eyes ulcerated. Looking at all of these symptoms, it's easy to understand why medieval people referred to leprosy as the living death. Fortunately, leprosy can be cured today with modern antibiotics. During the Middle Ages, however, there was no effective treatment. Once someone was diagnosed, they were usually separated from society and remained isolated for the rest of their life. To keep infected people away from the general population, medieval communities established leper colonies, many of which were operated by religious orders. People with leprosy were sent there to spend the remainder of their lives, rarely seeing the outside world again. Ironically, monks were often responsible for caring for those suffering from the disease. Many people believed the monks were somehow immune, not because anyone understood how the disease spread, but simply because they were viewed as holy men. In the minds of many medieval people, their closeness to God offered them protection, as though disease itself respected holiness. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, leprosy became so widespread that France alone was home to more than 2,000 leper houses, showing just how enormous the problem had become. As cases of leprosy began to decline around the beginning of the 15th century, another deadly disease started becoming more common: tuberculosis. It seemed like people in the Middle Ages could never catch a break. As one terrifying illness faded into the background, another was ready to take its place. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease that can affect the body in several different ways, and none of its forms are particularly pleasant. One of the best-known types during the Middle Ages was scrofula, a condition people commonly called the king's evil. This form of tuberculosis attacked the lymph nodes in the neck, causing them to swell until the neck became noticeably enlarged. Medieval writers often compared the appearance to the thick neck of a pig. At the time, many people believed that the king possessed a special God-given ability to cure the disease. In some cases, the king would place his hand directly on the sick person. More often, he would touch a coin, which was then given to the patient in the belief that it carried the power to drive the illness away. Thousands of desperate people traveled to receive this royal blessing. King Edward I is said to have performed the healing ceremony for as many as 2,000 people every year, showing just how widespread that belief had become. When tuberculosis infected the lungs, the illness usually started with a cough that became stronger and more persistent over time. Before long, the mucus people coughed up often contained small amounts of blood, one of the classic signs of pulmonary tuberculosis. The disease didn't stop there. Those who suffered from it often experienced constant exhaustion, a loss of appetite, noticeable weight loss, overwhelming weakness, anxiety, chills, aching muscles, heavy sweating, and recurring fevers. Tuberculosis didn't simply attack the lungs. It slowly drained every bit of strength from the body. Month after month, it wore people down until they no longer had the energy to fight, making it one of the most relentless and exhausting diseases of the medieval world. Now, let's talk about one of the most miserable diseases anyone in the Middle Ages could catch: dysentery, better known at the time as the bloody flux. It was one of the most common bacterial illnesses to spread through medieval armies, and it was every bit as unpleasant as its name suggests. Long military campaigns created the perfect conditions for the disease to spread. Food spoiled quickly, clean drinking water was hard to find, and sanitation was practically non-existent. Compared to many medieval army camps, even a modern portable festival toilet would have seemed clean and comfortable. Dysentery could cause severe stomach cramps, vomiting, and high fevers, but its most devastating symptom was relentless diarrhea. The constant loss of fluids often led to dangerous dehydration, bleeding, and, in many cases, death. Because the disease spread so easily through contaminated food and water, it could sweep through an entire military camp in a short time. Considering how poor food handling was during long campaigns, almost every meal carried some level of risk. Not even kings were protected from dysentery. King John of England died from the disease at Newark Castle in 1216. King Louis VIII of France also lost his life to dysentery during a military campaign in 1226, and England's King Henry V died from it while campaigning in France in 1422. For medieval rulers and ordinary soldiers alike, dysentery could be just as deadly as any enemy waiting on the battlefield. In the worst cases, the disease could kill with shocking speed. If someone lost too much fluid and wasn't able to replace it, death could come in as little as 6 hours. Unfortunately, medieval medicine had very little to offer. There was no reliable cure, so people simply had to wait and hope the illness passed while trying to replace the fluids they were losing. That may not sound very encouraging, but there was one small advantage. People were often given beer instead of water because the brewing process made it safer to drink than many contaminated water supplies. So yes, dysentery was miserable, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. On the bright side, at least your treatment often included a mug of beer, and dysentery was only one disease on a very long list. Medieval people also faced illnesses like ergotism, malaria, typhoid fever, and countless parasitic worm infections. Looking back, it almost feels as though everyday life in the Middle Ages was one long game of Russian roulette, except every chamber seemed to be loaded. Despite all of that, people somehow found ways to survive, adapt, and carry on with their lives. It really makes you appreciate just how fortunate we are to live in a time with modern medicine.